Hi, good morning. Social Studies 20-1 here again. We're looking at our third source. We're examining internment in actually Canada's past. So today we have a photograph. I'll give you a few seconds to examine the photograph and read the caption, and then we'll dive into it. All right, so what we have is a memorial, a plaque, and a statue of a Ukrainian immigrant close to home, near present-day Lake Louise, Alberta. And then if you read a little further, you can see that the Harper government set up a $10 million Canadian First World War I Internment Recognition Fund in 2008. And what this fund does is it's not compensating, survivors of the internment, but what the money is intended to do is support projects that commemorate the experience of those that, suffered through the internment between 1914 and 1920, and other people too that lost civil liberties during World War I in Canada. And so there's not a whole lot that you need to interpret, but I think what you're going after here is linking it to the course. So what I would first make a note of is I would explain the uh, the $10 million Internment Recognition Fund. Just as I explained it to you, it's not monetary compensation for survivors. It is money that is going to be used to promote and commemorate the experience of those that suffered through the camps during World War I. And so what I would spend some time doing at this point is explaining why would a government do this? And it's not that $10 million is a lot of money on the federal level, but why would a government think that it needs to do this, especially given that the event that they're commemorating happened a long time ago in 1914 through 1920? So what I would do is I would establish why the Ukrainian Canadians were interned. I would talk about that as part of my interpretation. And I'm not going to write a big long thesis about history on it, but I am going to say that the Ukrainian Canadians were branded enemy aliens because at that time, one of the enemies of Canada in World War I was Austria-Hungary. Much of the Ukraine at that time was controlled by the Empire of Austria-Hungary. And so a lot of Canadians took the next leap and believed that Ukrainian Canadians living in Canada were also a threat to Canada. Maybe Canadian freedom, maybe Canadian sovereignty, and so on. And I would also comment on that. I would say, listen, that notion is ludicrous. There's no way they were a threat to Canada, which would tell us that the internment of the Ukrainian Canadians was unjustified. It was not necessary for the government to do that at that time. And there's your answer. That's why the government is funding the $10 million to commemorate and recognize what happened to the Ukrainian Canadians in World War I, because they've since realized what they did was wrong, what they did was not necessary, it was not justified, hence the Internment Recognition Fund. And I don't know if you'd spend any time at all talking about whether or not it's enough money or too much money. When you interpret a source in social studies, you're not critiquing the source. You're just commenting on what the source is saying, what might be different perspectives of the source, hence the statue and the Internment Recognition Fund. I might also point out, too, that World War I ended in 1918. So even if the Ukrainian Canadians were a threat to Canada, they should have been let out when World War I ended, which of course was 1918. They were kept a full 2 years longer, which even further uh, perhaps calls on the government to recognize the unjustified act. They kept them longer than they should have, which tells us that maybe it's not that they were a political threat. Maybe this was just the result of prejudiced feelings and discrimination in Western Canada. You could maybe talk about that too. In terms of links, well, you're linking it to ethnocentrism. The government has since realized what they did was ethnocentric, which led to acts of discrimination. I would also link it to ultranationalism. Ultranationalism doesn't always mean killing people. It doesn't always mean an ethnic cleansing or a global conflict. Ultranationalism is any time that you use your influence as a country to harm others, to maybe expand at someone else's expense. And this could surely be an example of ultranationalism in Canada. It wasn't a violent one, but it was a sad example of ultranationalism right here at home in Canada, and you could talk about that too. Again, in terms of perspective, in a photograph, there's no hidden meaning. Like there's no satire. There's nothing to really figure out. But when you establish perspective in a photograph, you need to be thinking about how other groups would view the photograph. So, for example, what would a present day Ukrainian Canadian think about the statue, about the Internment Recognition Fund? Do they think it's enough? Do they think it's a starting point? And how would they feel about what happened to their ancestors at that time? It might make them think, I can't fully trust my government. I don't know. You would speculate on that a bit. What would be the government's perspective on the photograph and the recognition fund? To them, it might also be a starting point toward reconciliation. It's a recognition that what they did was wrong. And even though they didn't do it themselves, they feel responsible that it happened in Canada. And then finally, what might a member of the general public think when they see the photograph? What would be their perspective on it upon learning about all these things? You would bring all that into your interpretation as well. While we're at it, we should link them together. So you probably forgot source one from Tuesday. It was a long source. It talked about how the internment, in this case of the Japanese Canadians on the west coast of Canada, was not the result of a top-down approach, but rather the government was responding to a grassroots sentiment coming from people living on the west coast. In other words, the government responded to what a lot of people were calling for on the West Coast. They wanted the Japanese Canadians interned. We call that a grassroots movement. And so, quite often, when we think of government policies, we think it's the government imposing a policy on us, when maybe that's not true. Maybe in this case, based on the evidence that we see, the government was reacting to what the public wanted. And it goes on to say that even if you were against the internment, you kind of had to go along with this because um, you were doing it maybe to protect Japanese Canadians, to get them out of the general public, because then they could be prone to acts of discrimination, bullying, or maybe even frontier justice. So that was source number one. Source two was just the cartoon from yesterday, and I thought that one was pretty straightforward. I shouldn't say cartoon, I should say piece of propaganda. Those are two different things. And finally, just today's source. So, in terms of our links, well, obviously all three are about internment, and you could go down that road. Source one is trying to explain internment in Canada. Source two is kind of showing you how it happened in Canada when you dehumanize the enemy, as we do through propaganda. Internment can actually happen probably pretty easily. And then finally, source three is a reconciliation, a recognition of unjustified internment in Canada's past. You could talk about that. You could link all three through ultranationalism. Here is an explanation of ultranationalism. Here's why it happened. Again, with source two and source three, a recognition of ultranationalism and what's wrong with it. One further connection might be that sources one and three seem to be looking back. They seem to be offering like a postmodern perspective, a re-examination of Canada's past and history, where source two is kind of putting you right in the moment in Canada, the menacing of both coasts. I'm sure you have more. I'm sure that yours are better. And again, it's important that we keep doing this. I know you feel tempted to just enjoy the good weather outside and relax. I urge you not to. This matters. This counts. In the next year, you're going to be writing the diploma, and this is one of the things that'll be on the diploma. It's also a good way to learn about social studies as well. Well, there you go. Thanks for listening. I hope you got something out of that. Next week, there'll be another set of sources, and we'll start talking about that position paper too.